Ever since its release, Paladins has always struggled with being called an Overwatch clone, with many people saying that Hi Rez saw how successful Blizzard's hero shooter was and decided to copy and capitalize on the game's popularity. This plus the fact that Hi Rez has always been called out for chasing trends instead of developing original concepts for games really didn't help with these allegations, but the deeper you go down into the history behind Paladins, the more you realize that Blizzard might have been the one copy-pasting here, not the other way around. So when you pair that with all the other issues that Hi Rez struggled with during development, you can see how Paladins' decline in player base was almost just bound to happen. So let's talk about how Paladins got itself into the situation that it's in today. Now, Paladins officially entered open beta 4 months after Overwatch had came out, and to their credit, Hi Rez did manage to pull off a pretty fun hero shooter that at its peak had 60,000 players, and it was one of the top 10 most played games on Steam when it released. And I know I'm gonna get a lot of hate for saying this, but Paladins has always been like a much more casual Overwatch in my opinion. It was a casualized hero shooter that was a lot more welcoming for people who didn't want to pay $40 outright to play Overwatch, and while the game today does have a ranked mode and a small competitive scene, well, Hi Rez has always been known for casualizing game genres and making them more accessible, like how they did with Realm Royale and with Rogue Company. But despite the game's early success and dedicated following, the developers really messed up with how they handled the updates throughout its lifespan and caused a large portion of the community to just walk away. But before we get into that, let's deal with the accusations first. Overwatch was officially announced at BlizzCon on November of 2014. Meanwhile, Paladins was announced a year later at Gamescom 2015. So it makes a lot of sense when people think that Paladins was just ripping off Blizzard here, but the reality is that Paladins was actually inspired by a class-based shooter MMORPG game that came out all the way back in 2010. Hi Rez released a game called Global Agenda, which was in part inspired by Team Fortress 2. So everything always goes back to TF2, one of the oldest running and most successful hero shooter, class shooter games that are out there, still running to this day. But after Hi Rez finished with Global Agenda, they started working on a fantasy-based Global Agenda PvP-like game called Aurum, and that became the direct inspiration for Paladins. And in a Reddit post made by Hi Rez Todd from over 8 years ago, so this information has been out for a long time, they actually mentioned that Paladins was made using Global Agenda and Smite as a template, and that they were using Smite characters as placeholders to try to see if they could smash something together into a video game. And in this post, they even go as far as to give out a list of all the class similarities between Global Agenda and Overwatch, which is actually pretty curious because, you have a female sniper with poison mines and wall hack abilities, you have a male tank hero that uses a shield and a hammer, you have a female healer with a beam heal, a buff beam, and a flight ability. You know where I'm going with this, right? When you go through these comparisons, it's almost as if Blizzard was the one who copied Hi Rez in order to develop Overwatch, but because Overwatch had such a huge marketing impact and just everyone was talking about Overwatch, well, all this information kind of just got glanced over and forgotten about. And that ended up having an impact on Paladins' staying power, because even though Hi Rez had been working on the game before Blizzard even announced Overwatch, they unfortunately got stuck with the label of Overwatch clone. But a lot of people argue that what ended up happening afterwards would actually be even worse for Paladins. You see, Paladins had a large player base, and to this day, despite the Switch server shutting down and a couple more issues that we're going to talk about, the game still has a bunch of people playing it, so maintaining engagement has never really been an issue for Hi Rez here. The problem was that in trying to keep up with the ridiculously competitive market of first-person shooters, the dev team was running on a fast-paced 2-week update cycle with absolutely no direction in sight. According to the dev blog post on their official site, they were adding major changes to the game like crazy to try to keep the core gameplay from going stale, and it got to the point where they couldn't really properly assess how it was all tying in together. Like, they had no sense of what was going on. So they were just throwing crap at the wall, kind of just hoping something would stick and monetize, but what actually ended up happening is that the game ended up with severe bloat and thousands of bugs popping up and just multiple systems being ported from some of their different titles. So the game was just a mess of spaghetti code, to be honest. One of the most hated additions during this period was actually the infamous OB64, which was a universally hated update where Hi Rez introduced a pay-to-win mechanic with cards unbound. You see, Paladin had a card system where you could use different loadouts and custom builds with your characters to be able to play them differently, right? You had a fixed set of cards that you could just customize your character with. And for me, that meant I could use Pip, my favorite character, right? Traditionally a healer, and I would just be able to play him as a DPS, which obviously would upset my teammates because I would get no healing done, but I'd be able to play the game however I wanted and have fun doing it. But with the introduction of cards Unbound in OB64, you could upgrade the cards that you currently had in order to increase their effects, like you could deal more damage or reduce ability cooldowns, so there was a grind that was added in to give players something to work towards. The problem here came from the fact that leveling the cards took a ridiculous amount of grinding if you wanted to get them for free, and the cards were also being offered inside of microtransactions, so they were incentivizing competitive players to blow money on chests so that way they could get the best cards faster. And that's just one bad example of all the bad decision making that was going on behind the scenes with the team at Paladins, and the main reason why a big chunk of the player base decided to quit at the time. But funny enough, when Hi Rez decided to finally step up and start fixing everything that was wrong with the game, that also wasn't very well received by the players. Some people were actually enjoying just how much more polished Paladins was feeling, but in the process of fixing all the spaghetti updates and features that they introduced, they also started doing regressive updates where they started off by cutting back and taking things away from the current gameplay experience. So like, for example, one of the biggest things was third-person mode, right? Third-person mode was removed entirely from gameplay, and that was actually my favorite way to play the game in the first place. I remember I got back from a break to play Paladins again, and I just found out I just couldn't go into third-person mode anymore, and I really just ended up uninstalling the game again after that gaming session, right? Because that was just like my main way to play. But you know, I totally understand why the developers decided to remove it, because it was a feature that was poorly implemented and it was just giving them a lot more bugs with every coming updates, and it was just like way too much for them to handle and also be able to focus on bringing in new things into the game. And like another thing that they got rid of was kill cams and top plays from the game as well. So like from a developer standpoint, I totally understand where they're coming from with wanting to optimize and polish the game, but from a player standpoint, someone who doesn't keep up to date with whatever the developer's doing, you're just left wondering like what's going on with the game. You know, there's missing things here and it kind of just demotivates you from playing. And let's not forget that Paladins to this present day still doesn't have crossplay progression with PlayStation, and they did have their Switch version shut down as well. So for like a dedicated fan that knows what's going on with the development studio, you can kind of like understand where they're coming from. But your typical casual player, which just happens to be a huge chunk of the player base, well, you know, that's just signals that Paladins is just dying, and it's more of a motivator for them to want to go play something else. So while the presence of Overwatch did play a pretty big part in having people see Paladins as just another ripoff game, I would say that, you know, it's pretty apparent that Paladins did get hit with the Hi Rez curse, right? They just suffer from poor management, they suffer from poor marketing, poor communication, poor implementation of features, and honestly, it's just surprising the fact that there's so many people still playing it despite the fact that it's gone through so many blunders throughout the years. Like, I've seen games die for much less than what Paladins has gone through, and Paladins surprisingly still has a pretty steady player base. You know, it is declining over the years because that is just how the live service model works, but they're still holding on somehow. And with the Hi Rez corporate restructuring that went on, plus the chaotic landscape of the gaming industry in today's market, it's honestly surprising to see Paladins still up and running like normal despite all the chaos it's gone through. But you know, at the same time, if the game decided tomorrow like, hey guys, we're done with this, we're gonna shut down, we're not making money, I also wouldn't be surprised at that, you know? So yeah, that's all I really wanted to talk about with you guys today, so thank you guys for watching, and I'll catch you on the next one.